So if the three of us were going on a trip somewhere and the plane went down over, let's say, Alaskan wilderness, what is the one skill that you bring to the table? If all of us are alive, right? We're survivors of the plane crash. What's one skill that you guys bring to the table? All right, we're all doomed.
Yeah. Man, I don't know that I have like nature skills that way. I mean, I would say in general, I have leadership skills. I can stay focused. Like, I don't give up. So like, I'm going to be the guy that's like, we're fine. Let's go. Keep going. You know,
so
perseverance.
Not to jump off the answer, but like there's an SAS book that I have. It's like SAS is the British Special Forces. Mm-hmm. He writes it's like a survivor's book. That is like one of the key like traits of when you have multiple people surviving in a location. Like that's an important thing. Like one of the top important things.
You need someone to have like some serious grit and perseverance.
Yeah, just somebody who can keep a cool head and keep everybody. Yeah,
I'll keep you both alive.
Yeah, there you go.
I'll tell you what, with you guys talking about all these like 24-hour running a million miles and all this stuff, you better have some grit after all that.
Yeah, you know, I think sports do. I mean, we've all played sports. I think sports, if you're an athlete, it does teach you to persevere. It teaches you to fight through that pain barrier, because you're going to be uncomfortable and you just have to learn to get past that. And so my whole life playing athletics and even now with CrossFit and things like that, I have a mindset that I don't really stop because of pain. I was able to play through injuries. And so I wouldn't want to crash, but if I did, it would almost be the challenge of like surviving would be like, we're going to do this.
For sure.
Let's go.
I think tool making and endurance. So like if we had to travel a long way to get food or whatever, like I think those two things would be my kind of my skill set.
Mine would be probably like hunting, fishing. Like I've done enough of it and read enough books over the years. Like I used to in high school, it was really weird just because of like the people that I hung out with and stuff. But I used to I would go to like the library during study hall and just read books, and most of them had to do with like outdoor survival. Some of them were like fictional stories, like Gary Paulson, who wrote Hatchet, which a lot of people had to read when they were in like 8th grade or maybe even younger. But he wrote a ton of books. He was from like Minnesota, and he was really into that stuff. So all his books had those themes. But man, back in the day, I used to think it was like the coolest thing. Like the show Alone, that wasn't around. I mean, that was forever ago. I used to think that idea would be so cool, like to be left out in the woods with like a knife and a couple of tools and have to survive.
The one I've only watched a couple of seasons of Alone, and I think the one I saw was it was, I gotta think about this. It was like all people who had been on the show before, and then if they survived 100 days, they got $1 million.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
But it was so cold that even watching it, I just felt cold. I don't know that I could survive that long in cold. I hate being cold.
So have to be a tropical paradise.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying my chance of survival is much greater if I'm somewhere warm. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that none of us ever have to actually be in that situation.
I thought the question you were going with, you're like, if a plane crashes and there's the three of us, I thought you were going to say something like, and we have to fight each other.
Yeah, who do you think's
surviving?
Who do you think's coming out of that one?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't ask that question. Well, hey, we want to welcome you guys to the Branch podcast. For those of you who normally follow, you know that it's an opportunity for us to talk about biblical, theological ideas and how they apply to our lives. And so today I wanted to actually talk about Pastor Chris's message from Sunday and really talk about this idea of living a cross-centered life and really what does that mean and what does that look like. And so we really heard you talk about this idea of how Jesus modeled this, not just in going to the cross, but all of his life in a metaphorical way, you might say, demonstrated the way of the cross. And I think you even touched on this. I know, Matthew, you've touched on this before. Really the idea of a cross being such an important symbol for so many people, a popular symbol for so many people. So many people have cross tattoos. You even talked about it Sunday. You have a cross necklace that is significant to you. You see it on people's back windows of their vehicles. Do you think most people really have a solid understanding of what the cross represents from a biblical standpoint?
No. No, I mean, absolutely no. I think it is, you could say for the most people, and I'm not saying this just to sound condescending, I'm just saying from the discussion we're about to have, this is what I think. I think for most people, it's a good luck charm. It is a religious symbol that if I have it, somehow that makes me approved by God.
Yeah.
And so people think it makes them spiritual. This makes me whatever, the title of a Christian. If I have this symbol, and the reason why you can say that is they don't live a lifestyle that even represents it. And I'm imagining this conversation will go that direction at some point, but their lifestyle doesn't match what that symbol was supposed to mean.
Yeah.
And so therefore I would say they don't get it. They don't understand, because to wear it is a dramatic thing. I mean, Chris is wearing it, but it means something to Chris.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so like, if you're really embracing the posture of the cross, that is a dramatically different way to live than anyone else in the world is living. And so if your life doesn't reflect that, I don't think you really fully understand what it means.
Yeah, I was gonna say it really is. It's not that, and even places where I don't know if it's a thing that's misunderstood. I think it's a thing that's not enjoyed. Like, and I don't think people like it. Like, we like power. We like to be on top. We like to be the guy, and the cross represents something completely opposite of that. And so it represents sacrifice. It represents laying down your life. And so you have an understanding of like, yeah, I think people understand what it means, or maybe they don't understand what it means, but I don't think they like what, in reality, it's almost like a person who's like, I like to go fishing, and they never go fishing. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So like they like the idea of fishing, but they don't actually like what fishing means, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I wanted to just, I think what you said is exactly spot on. I think the other thing is people, particularly those who maybe grew up in the church, who have some sort of Christian background, right? They know that in some way the cross represents obviously salvation. And so there is this idea of, okay, Jesus went to the cross, he died on a cross. I mean, even if you were to ask people, what is Christianity about, or what is the good news, there would be some semblance of that idea of Jesus died on the cross for my sins. But the reality is that's only one facet of it, because even Jesus himself invites discipleship with this idea of, take up your cross. So for Jesus, it wasn't just something that he did. And this was the point that you really made in your whole message. It really demonstrated, like his entire life was demonstrated by the way of the cross. And so on one side, I think we do like the idea of, Jesus died for my sins, therefore I have salvation. But we stop there without understanding, no, actually the cross should also be shaping our own lives and what that actually looks like. So that's the other thing I'd love to talk about. What are some words that maybe you would even associate? You kind of already alluded to one of them, sacrifice. When we talk about living a cross-centered life, what does that actually mean?
I think it always involves sacrifice, one that I already said, but I think there's always a level of submission that's involved. A submission to who God is and what he wants for our lives, a willingness to submit for the good of other people. And maybe there's a lot of conversation of like, is service and submission the same thing? Not technically, no, but at the same time, they embody the same heart. It's a heart that goes, I trust, and I'm going to put someone else above my own personal needs and stuff. So you've got that humility and like, which again embodies kind of very similar ideas of seeing others as more important than yourself. And so I think those qualities really embody what the cross stands for, what Jesus represented. And even in his roles where he was authoritative and where he was, I mean, he gave up his equality with God, but he really still he really still had the authority of God, you know what I mean? And so like, you get this idea that power, all the things that we think are so important in this world, get flipped on their head when you look at the way that he came, he embraced life and lived his life.
Yeah, I mean, the cross is all the things Chris said. It's total surrender to God, because so the actual imagery, and this is something that Chris alluded to, we've talked about, and I've mentioned it numerous times in teaching, is first of all, the cross was the most violent form of execution that had been created really probably up to that point and in their culture. So when he was talking about it, and this was before Jesus had been crucified. And so I often say, like, we have to some degree, and I don't mean this as a negative, but I would say to some degree, we have romanticized the cross because it is so special to us because of what Jesus did on the cross. But if you remove that and just understand, when Jesus was saying this to the audience, they had none of that context, and it was still very true. He was talking about a person who dies. Well, a person who dies has nothing anymore. Their life is done. They've surrendered everything. They've been, whether it was their choice or someone else's choice. I don't think anyone besides Jesus chose to be crucified.
Right.
But in that situation, it's all gone. You have lost all power. So when Jesus is saying you need to willfully do this, it is only in the context of your relationship with God. So it is, you're dying to yourself to totally surrender your life to God. And I think that's the reason why I would say the most people that have this image, it doesn't really mean anything to them because they don't know, it doesn't represent execution. Chris made the joke, and I've heard it in other ways too, but like, would you have a necklace of an electric chair, right? Yeah. Like, or some other form, a chamber, like where they're going to put someone to dead. You're not going to wear that around your necklace, or if you did, it would mean something to you. Yeah. So the cross, like, I even know for us as a church, this sounds more on the negative than I mean it to be, but I know as a church, we used to do child dedication, and we eventually got away from it because it became in many ways, on one part, just a photo op, and on the other part, it just became almost like this mindset that if I do a dedication of my child is fine. They have now got their get out of hell free card, as people would say, and they're good. I think it's very similar with infant baptism for some. And then the other part about it, like the sad reality, I've seen numerous times where people get baptized and then you never see them again. And so like in their mind, it's just like, I have to do these things. So like child dedication, check. I was baptized, check. Oh, I'm wearing a cross, or I got the tattoo, check. And I'm thinking, you guys are missing the value of it. The value of the cross is total surrender, but it's total surrender so that you can receive the life that Jesus offers. And so when he poses the question, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? He's like, what if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? Like, what is that? But the flip of it, what if you surrender everything and what you actually get is life? That's the beauty of the tension of what Jesus was offering. Jesus wasn't offering death just for death. Right. He was offering death for life. He was saying, if you die to yourself, what I can give you is life. And that's the sad part about it. I don't judge people who wear a cross. I just hope that they're fully embracing the message because of what Jesus so generously offers us.
Yeah, and I love the idea that you mentioned there, the idea of that exchange. And what I was thinking of was, even when I was preparing the message, like I think so often we get lost in this place where like we either love the sacrificial element of it, like almost like I get the man up and do the sacrifice thing, or we hate that part of it and we want Jesus just to do the trick that he did on the cross and give us life. You know what I mean? Right. Just give it to us. In reality, like it's this beautiful picture that Christ frees us from our sin so that we can find life. And so that, like, I don't know, I love that whole image of it's a trade-off for something better.
For sure. And I think it gives us a deeper meaning. I mean, we've talked about this before on other podcasts, a deeper understanding of what salvation actually is, right? Because if you see the cross only as, okay, Jesus went and he died for me, yes, that's true. He died for our forgiveness so that ultimately we could be reconciled in right relationship to God. But as you guys both alluded to, he also died so that we would be liberated from this life of living for self and actually fully surrendered life to God, so that we're no longer enslaved to sin, as Paul says in Romans 6. And I think of even Romans 12, where Paul actually equates this entire idea to the idea of worship, right? To offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. It's funny because I've heard over the years growing up as a kid, those hypothetical situations, if a person had a gun to your head and said, deny Jesus, would you die for him? Would you die for Jesus? I think a lot of people would like to say, yeah, I would. I would say I believe in Jesus. But the real question of discipleship, and really the question of Christianity, is will you live for him? Will you offer him your life? Not just in a moment would you lay your life down, but as Paul says, would you offer your entire life, seeing that really is your worship? It's to say, God, all of me belongs to you. You can have your way. I'm going to surrender and submit to you. That is really the essence of what a cross-shaped life looks like.
Well, isn't that the choice before us every single time we're given the opportunity to either obey or disobey?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
right, for sure it is. And that's, I mean, the passage you just quoted, the idea of a living sacrifice, or as Jesus were to say, to take up your cross daily. It is an ongoing process because you're always going to face different situations that require that moment of, okay, am I going to obey now? Because you could take up your cross for a season and then stop taking up your cross because you find something that in your own mind and heart is more valuable than surrendering it. And that's the deception of the world. And so when Jesus is describing the cross, so again, the cross is this most violent imagery, and Jesus goes, yeah, you have to do that every single day. he's not sugarcoating. He's not baiting and switching. The process of discipleship is difficult,
Right.
but it's worth it. And that's what I often say to people. It's difficult, but it's worth it. But you'll never know that truth until you go through the pain of surrender. And that is tough. I mean, I've often said it in the context, I think one of the greatest gifts that God has given us to teach us how to die is marriage. And, it sounds like I'm saying a negative about marriage, but I'm actually saying a positive. When you are forced to surrender your will, your rights, your pride, all of those things in order for the other person to thrive, and you just have your shortcomings exposed over and over in the context of this beautiful relationship, but intense relationship, you are faced consistently with the choice, do I want to die again? Do I want to die again? And as you go through that, you start to realize this is what it's like to truly follow Jesus. It's a conscious decision to die and to surrender. And it's difficult, but again, it's worth it.
Yeah, so you lead into what was going to be my next question, and this was something that you kind of pointed out. It was one of your first application points, but this idea, I think you framed it the way of the cross. I'm saying the cross-centered life, which is really the same thing.
Yeah.
Really, it calls us to love other people. It calls us to put others before ourselves rather than living a life of selfishness. So I want to talk about that for a few minutes. Number one, and we've covered this really in a lot of ways, but if we can kind of just summarize it, how does this contradict what is natural to us? And how does this really contradict the very current of the society that we live in? Living a life actually for other people, living a life of love rather than living a life of total selfishness or a life focused on self.
Well, we live in a culture that is hyper-individualism, and I'm not the first one to say that, right? I mean, this is acknowledged now by both Christians and non-Christians alike. Our culture celebrates the individual rights, and I would say this is even magnified in America. America, we have so many wonderful things, but part of the foundation of our country are our rights. So even the Constitution was written, and then the First Amendment was the Bill of Rights. So like this idea of, or the first, I guess it'd be 10 amendments. Am I saying that correctly? Or the Bill of Rights?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Let's just all acknowledge that we think this is true. And if it's not, Alex, edit this out of the podcast. We don't look like idiots. But anyway, but that was intentional, that they said, here's the Constitution. Yeah. And then the very first thing they did was the 10 amendments, which are the Bill of Rights. And so you look at that, it's like our foundation of our nation is individual rights. This is what we have.
Right.
Okay, so when you are a Christian and an American, like there is that tension. So we live in a culture of hyper individualism, which is magnified by consumerism. And so we are trained from a very early age. We have the money, so therefore we have the rights and power, and people have to fight for our money, and so we have all these rights. And so we will just naturally, you don't even have to necessarily be taught it, you will naturally pick up that you have rights. And so focus on yourself, defend yourself. And in our culture, I would even say, it is a celebrated thing. If a person defends their rights and is successful, that is celebrated. Almost rarely would that be ridiculed. No, those are your rights and you fought for them. Like, good on you for doing that. Then you come along and Jesus goes, no, it's just not my pathway. And so, like, you alluded to it, but Philippians 2, where Jesus, though he's in the form of God, did not see equality with God as something to grasp, but he surrendered himself. He took on the form of his creation. And he modeled this person who had all these rights. The glory was due him. He deserved it. It was his. And he surrendered it to take the form of his creation, to submit himself to his creation, to the point of dying on the cross. And we look at this, and the encouragement is, he's our example. Man, that's tough to do. That's so hard to do. But in our culture, we have to take a step back and realize what's natural in the American way is not the Jesus way. It's not the life of the cross. It's not the message of the cross.
Well, it even goes back to what you said earlier. It's the exchange. And so, like, you're right, Jesus does have all these rights and he's got all of these privileges, but for the good of other people, for the good of us, essentially, he gave up those things. And so if we think about it in our context, yeah, the Bill of Rights is good. Like, having rights is a good thing. It's that, do you love those rights more than you love the other person? Do you love those rights at the cost of other people? And I think that's where a lot of times in our culture we lose track of that, and we go, having my rights doesn't cost that person anything. And at times, that might be true if that person is exactly like you, if that person lives in a community and it has all the same privileges and benefits that you do. If they don't, your rights might be impinging on them. Are you willing to give up your rights for the good of that person so that they might find life? This was Paul's whole thing in Corinthians. He's like, you have these rights. You think it's okay, and you have this freedom to eat meat that is sacrificed to idols. And Paul's like, you and I both know it's not really a thing. It's not nothing to worry about, but it bothers them. And you're now exercising your right at the cost of someone else's faith.
Yeah.
And so like, yeah, rights are good. Rights are okay. But does it come at a cost for somebody else? And I think that's an important question we have to ask ourselves and even get creative with how we think about that. Because if you look at American history, there's been a lot of times that, and I'm going to go there, white males had a lot of privilege and a lot of rights that a lot of people did not have, and they came at the cost of other people, they didn't just have them.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the issues is we've created a culture of entitlement, right? Like we as people, I mean, even again, the dark side of the Bill of Rights, the dark side of our Constitution, even though in so many ways it's incredible and it's offered us incredible lives that many people around the world are not able to experience. The flip side of that, when it does come in conflict with the Christian way of life, the cross-centered life, I think so often we are entitled, and even that whole posture, it contradicts really our posture before God, in that we are called to be humble, we're called to be grateful, we're called to realize that everything we have is of grace, right? In that we haven't deserved or earned anything from God. There's not a single thing we can say, I earned that from God, I deserve that. And so it even actually shapes the way that we approach God if we start to believe, well, life is really all about me. It's all about getting what I want. And there is this sense in which the pursuit of happiness, we have been sold this idea that the pursuit of happiness is only going to be found, right? The end goal there of actually experiencing happiness is a life that is focused on self. Right. And that's, I think you guys were alluding to earlier, the unique aspect of Christianity is actually saying it's not only that this is the way of Jesus and what Jesus modeled and what Jesus calls us to do, it's actually that in doing that, you do find greater life. So the very thing that you're looking for, happiness, joy, contentment, is actually not found in living a self-indulgent life. It's not about making life all about you. It's actually about laying your life down for the sake of other people. And so I think that's one of the other ways we've bought this idea that the more I make life about myself, because of our society, because of every commercial and marketing scheme we see used, it's all about you. It's all about getting what you want. That the more that I indulge in that, the happier I'll be. The reality of Christianity says, no, it's actually not intended to be that way. And the more you give yourself away, the more you'll actually experience the fullness of life that God intends for you.
Yeah, I think COVID exposed this, I think, to a very public level, that people were, I would say specifically Christians, were not willing to surrender their rights for the better good. I mean, think about how much shade was thrown at churches for stopping in-person meetings, churches like mandating that people wear masks. Like, I know for us as a church, we had so many people get mad, people quit, people left, and they saw it as a compromise. They saw it as like, you are giving in to the government, and they spun it in such a way that it was like the worst way possible.
Sure.
And it was interesting hearing them say it, where I thought, like, when you would hear someone say it, I would go, well, that seems true to you because we don't have the same value system. This wasn't us compromising, us giving into the government as if it's a negative thing.
Sure.
We were taking a posture saying, what can we do that's being a good part of the community? Is there some rights that we can surrender and yet still be a witness? And what was ironic to me in a very heartbreaking way was so many people who did not claim to be a part of the faith. And I'm even going to say this just for clarity, like even people who would lean more left, more liberal, and would not lean toward Christianity or conservatism, were willing to surrender their rights. And the Christians, who are supposed to be the ones leading the way, were the most militant to not surrender rights. And it was sad. It was heartbreaking to me because they saw it as this compromise. Yeah. You are compromising. And what was interesting, we weren't compromising the faith. No one had a valid argument for that. Yeah. It was, you're compromising as an American. And I'm going, like, and that was so hard for me. It was, I'm
giving up your rights. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, I'm a Christian pastor. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. Yeah. And we feel this is what's best for the community. And I thought that was what we chose and other churches chose, was so respectful and honoring. And the fact that people were getting mad at it, I was like, you don't understand the cross, honestly. Right. Like, this is going back to where we began. Yeah. You don't understand what it means to die to yourself, because a simple thing, and I hated it. I'll be the first to admit, I didn't love not having in-person services. I didn't love wearing masks. I didn't love those things. But if I can't even surrender those rights,
Right.
am I really going to die to myself in other areas? And the truth of it is you wouldn't.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a good point, that it wasn't this like joyful compliance, but rather like, no, we've actually thought about this, we've prayed about this, and we really do think that this is a way to love and serve the community, which was another part of my question. I mean, when we think about the culture we live in right now that is so geared towards self-indulgence, focus on yourself, take pictures of yourself, post them on Instagram, give the highlight reel of how great your life is, all of those things that I think reinforce this self-focused way of living. What are some practical ways as 21st century Americans, as you guys can think of them, what are some practical ways that we can even maybe subtly shift some of those things and actually start to love people a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, I think beginning for me, I'll just say with marriage, I would say in relationships, not looking at it as the value of this relationship is going to be one-sided. What can this person provide for me? Which is what we kind of naturally do.
Right.
So I just performed a wedding ceremony last week. One of my staff members got married, and beautiful couple. They both love Jesus and they're serving Jesus. But one of the things when talking with them prior to the marriage, and even a part of the ceremony that I do, is I talk about the way that this marriage is going to be successful is if you die to yourself. It's the only way to survive. In our culture, I think we're so often taught you have to find the right person. You hear that all the time. And so people will get divorced because, it just turned out they weren't the right person. And I often think, what do you think the right person is? Is the right person the one who just meets all of your expectations? Because if you're thinking about that, I think that's an illusion. I don't think it's a real thing. The right person is the one that you choose in your own heart. I'm going to die to myself so that they might live. So in relationships, that's where it has to begin, is whether it's marriage or just any relationship, how can I live in a way to better that person? So we all have had, it's funny as I say this in context, I was about to say, we all have had that annoying coworker, but I'm just saying, like, we've all worked in environments. Yeah, I'm thinking of even jobs I had before I came here. But you've had those relationships that are harder, right?
Yeah.
Where it's, and so what's natural is, I'm going to avoid that person, the room that they're in, working with them. I'm going to avoid it at all costs. The person who dies to themselves goes, how can I love that person well? And then even the boss relationship, how can I serve my boss in such a way that betters their life? And again, every place you go to. So if you're out in public, you're driving your car and someone has their turn signal in because they were just being too aggressive, and you think, well, I'm not going to let you get over. The Christian goes, it's okay, I'm going to let them get over. In the restaurant, the waiter, waitress that's having a bad day, you don't have to tell them off. You don't have to get to the manager. You don't have to leave them a bad tip. You can love them. You can serve them well by dying to yourself. So, I mean, I think my first thing is relationally, just thinking in every relationship, how can I make it better for the other people, the other person in this?
Yeah.
I think a lot of it stems back to the place where we as a culture, we're individually focused, but we're also individually dependent. So like what I mean is we're dependent on ourselves. And so when you remove God from the equation of being our provision, you now have a lack. And you're operating out of a place of scarcity instead of abundance. And so if you're afraid that you're not going to have enough, you have to protect, you have to fight for what's going to make you feel good and make you feel right. You know what I mean? But if you're united back to that relationship with God, and God is that provision, you now can operate from a place of abundance, and somebody else needing something from you no longer is a threat to you being satisfied. And so like stepping into a place like that allows us to go where we're trusting God and believing He has provision, allows us to come to those relationships, like you said, Matthew, and be willing to go, like, I can give up my rights because I know God is going to take care of me in the places my heart needs, because I think we all have needs, and I don't think we can escape that, you know what I mean? But is God there to provide for that so that you can live the way that Jesus did? Because that's why Jesus lived the way that He did. He was connected to the Father. He knew that He was going to be cared for. And so when you operate from that place of abundance of God's provision, it's a lot easier to live a life of love.
Yeah, it makes me think of even like specifically Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 when he's talking about the spiritual gifts. I mean, he makes it abundantly clear that the Holy Spirit gives these things for us to edify others, right? Like this idea of, and that's true on a more macro scale, not just specifically the spiritual gifts. I know we talk about this all the time, the money that we have, the jobs that we have, the house that we live in, that everything has been given to us, not just so that we can enjoy it. That is one facet of it, but so that we can be a blessing to other people, that we can build other people up, that we can seek to make other people's lives better. And I love where you went, because it was one of the things that you touched on. And so I wanted to talk about this, the idea of dependence, right? We live in a society that very much reinforces this idea of living very independent lifestyles. In fact, a person who's independent is a person who's kind of elevated, exalted, right? They made their own way, their own pathway, and they made it, and they're successful. That's something that we actually lift up in our society. And yet the cross-centered life actually calls us to live differently. It calls us to a level of God dependence rather than self-reliance. And so, what are some ways right now, again, as we look at our culture, that we are constantly being taught this, like this is something that we should aspire towards? Because I really do think all of us could probably admit that we struggle with it to some level. But as American Christians, this idea of living self-reliant lifestyles where we're dependent on no one, in fact, that's the goal, is to not be dependent on anyone else. And how has that really shaped or misshapen our faith?
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said. So if you look at what God celebrates, not only does he celebrate dependence upon him, I would even say he celebrates dependence upon the community of believers.
Yeah,
so when Paul uses the language that we are a body and then describes that we all play a part, he even says if one part suffers, we all suffer. And so, and if one is having joy or rejoices, we all rejoice with them. There's this idea that we're in this together. So our culture's idea of independence and celebrating the success of the individual does stand in opposition to the value system of God, and the value system of God is based on how he designed us to be. So when we are embracing culture's standard of independence, we are embracing a model or a blueprint that God did not give us. And so we're going to consistently be frustrated by that. And so we have to learn to operate in such a way, sounds weird, but we have to learn to operate in such a way that embraces dependence. And so we have to, in relationships, begin to I think we have to increase humility, lower pride, and start to acknowledge, I actually can't do this by myself. I think anyone who gives off that image is, they're putting on a mask. Because you can't do it by yourself. No one's ever been successful by themselves. I mean, every success level in any countries is based on the generations before them. So like, all the men and women who fought in the military to get us to where we are, we're all indebted to them. But even in life, like I know for me, I just naturally bought into the idea of independence just because that's how I was raised. I'm not saying that like in a bad way. My parents were Christians and stuff, but you just naturally pick up on it. Like if I'm more independent, I'm more successful. So I thought as a lead pastor that the greatest service I could provide for our church and the staff would be to become self-sufficient and just basically me and God. So like, I'm going to depend on God, but I can't let the staff see my shortcomings. I can't see the staff. I can't let the staff see my weaknesses and the seasons that I struggle. And I realized early on that was unhealthy and unbiblical. And what I really needed was to have healthy community, support network, the friendships, the community that encouraged me. But in order to have true community, I had to let them into a piece of me that was vulnerable, to say in front of people that I'm supposed to lead, I'm struggling. And that wasn't natural for me. It's easier now, but it's still not easy now for me to do that. But even in my preaching on Sunday, to say to the church, I remember the first time I referenced that Mary and I got in a fight. Like I just referenced it in a sermon where I was like, yeah, Mary and I were fighting. And I remember afterwards, I had so many people come to me, they're like, I've never heard a pastor say that them and their spouse fight. And I was like, what did you think happened in our marriage? But I just remembered like it was refreshing to people to hear that. And I was like, oh, that's good. That's interesting. But all that said is like, it had to be a purpose decision to start to be vulnerable, to invite people into that relationship and to learn to be dependent so that someone else can encourage me. Someone else can take some of the burden off of my life. But it's hard.
I would say a place that I recognize it in my life is this is going to sound way more smarter than it really is, but like the whole idea.
More smarter.
Yeah. Well, let me preface it and keep myself humble here. But like we live in a cash for services economy. And so like there is this mindset that we have where I go to work, I work my hours, I deserve the wages that I get from my job. So now if I go to work, if I do these things, I can take care of myself. If I don't, I'm not going to have the income. But if I go to work, so like it creates this level of independence, for lack of better terms. Even though
Sure.
you're dependent on the employer, you're dependent on the economy doing well so they can have jobs for you. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of places that you are dependent, but in our minds we go, I go to work, I'm the one who provides for my family. I'm the one who does everything that I need. And so it's for me, it's about me, and we can leave it at that. And so like I know in my life there's times when I feel most independent when that bank account's full, when things are going well, and life is kind of flowing the way that I expect or want it to.
Sure.
And so it's those moments where the rug gets pulled out from underneath you that you finally realize how dependent you are, because for that to happen, all these circumstances have to fall into place. And if they don't, where are you left? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think one of the things that, like, you think about the practicalities of life. So often we have help getting started with things. So, before you get married, you get premarital counseling. Well, some people do. You should do that. You're getting started there. You get a new job. You get some sort of job training. A lot of things in life, we have help getting started, and then it's kind of like, well, good luck. Figure it out on your own. And I think we view the Christian life that way, in the sense that, right, we realize, okay, we're not saved by our works. We're saved by grace through faith. Jesus died for us, and then we enter into this relationship with God. And I think a lot of times we do that just the same way as we do other elements of life, where it's like, okay, Jesus got us started, now it's up to me.
Yeah.
And I think one of the pitfalls of that, right, is we talk about this all the time, this idea of living a spirit-led life, a spirit-filled life. Well, the only way to do that is through dependence on God, right? It's through recognizing, no, I actually don't have the strength to do this on my own. I don't have enough wisdom to make all these wise, right decisions. I mean, you think about the commands of Scripture, right? That so much of it is assumed that we're going to go back to God again and again and again and again. I mean, we've talked about it before. So John 15, Jesus is very clear in that. Apart from me, you can do nothing. The one who abides in me is the one who bears good fruit and bears much fruit. And so I think so often we think, okay, Jesus gets us started, but it's up to me now. I can't mess it up, right? I have to be strong enough. I have to almost prove myself to God. I have to prove my faith by my own strength. But the reality is, the more that we depend on God, the more that we go to God, the more that we acknowledge our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, our shortcomings, that's where, as Paul would say, that's where God's strength shows up, right? In our weaknesses. Now, the tension with all of this, and I want to acknowledge this because I think some people would be thinking about this when it comes to being independent. On one side, I think all of us would agree there can be something good about ambition, and definitely something good about having a hard work ethic, right? Someone who wants to work hard, someone who wants to do what is right. How do we then as Christians balance that in the everyday moments of our lives where, you are setting the alarm and you're getting up and you're doing your devotions and you're doing what you need to do at your job, all of those things? How do you balance that where you having a good work ethic, that's something to be celebrated, and at the same time, we also always want to be dependent on God?
It is the response to the gracious gift of God that he gives us. Like, hard work is not it's not like contrasting grace, and it's not contrasting that God provides. Hard work can be a recognition of God provides for me, so this is my response. You know what I mean? I was trying to think, when Adam and Eve are given the task to fill the earth and subdue it, and that idea is you're going to work and you're going to care for it and you're going to steward this creation. Was that no less a gift from God? Absolutely not. Was it no less dependent on God's provision every single day? Absolutely not. Were they called to do something? Yes. You know what I mean? And so it's a level of, like, when we do work, when we work hard, when we're excellent at the things that we do, we reflect the excellent God. And when we take those gifts and we care for them and we are responsible with them, I believe it honors God, because it celebrates the fact that we recognize this has value because God gave it to us, and so we're going to care for it and steward it in the way that he would want us to.
Yeah, I think there is always that tension in Scripture of works and grace. That on one hand, some would say, well, which one is it? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think when you get them out of order, that's when the problem is. When you think works is going to lead you to earn something, that's when it gets unhealthy. When you realize because of grace, you're called to works, and you put it in that proper perspective, I think then it becomes a very beautiful thing. So I would say how do you balance it? I think in your life, you have to be consistently getting into God's presence. So we just got back literally today from a staff retreat that we do a couple times a year. And it's a spiritual retreat where the directors go and we pray and we get into God's presence. And what I stressed with our staff over the last 2 days was taking time to get into God's presence. I just kept saying it over and over to you guys. This is what we have to do in order to be healthy in our leadership roles. Because here's what I know for all of us. We're going to work. We're going to work really hard, and we're going to build systems, and it's going to be, it's going to be the fruit of our labor. And so in many ways, it's what we are doing. But I'm like, the only way to do it in a healthy way is to always get into God's presence, because not only will he guide you, but he'll critique you, he'll challenge you, he'll correct you where you need to be corrected. Because there are times in all of our ministries, every single one of us, if we've had any success in ministry at any point, there's another moment where we have to lay that on the altar again to say, God, I don't want this to become about my ego or my success. And honestly, I don't think God is put off when we celebrate success because we're using his gifts to bring him glory. I don't think he's such a jealous father that he's like, no, stop it. You can't, I think he finds glory in his children, doing good things. But I think we have to always check our hearts to make sure we have that motivation. For me, it's just being purpose, to consistently be in the presence of God. When I'm not in the presence of God, like that is one of the things he spoke to me this week that I shared with the staff. He told me, he said, my ministry and my heart are always going to be connected. The state of my heart and the state of my ministry my leadership will always be the same. If I am wounded, I will wound people. If I am healthy, I will lead in a healthy way. And so again, it's that purpose decision to make God a priority. And if people aren't doing that, then I would say they are in an unsafe place, because then works become a motivator and independence becomes a motivator. But when you have God as a center leading you, then he becomes the motivator, and that's when it falls in the proper place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both of you guys really pointed this out. I think it's first and foremost acknowledging that God is the source of everything. I know we talked about that recently in the podcast on, finances, the other 90. What do we do with all this? But we have to acknowledge that everything we have really does come from God, because the moment we do that, the moment we kind of snap out of this illusion that we are fully dependent,
100%.
and that we are doing things by our own strength and by our own wisdom, because then you have to stop and say, man, even the gifts that I'm using, the physical body that I operate out of, all of these are being sustained by God. All of these are being given to me by God. And so it reframes your perspective. And so you acknowledge God as the source, and then you reframe it as, it is my responsibility then to work hard and to do the things that God has called me to do, to use the gifts that God has given me for his kingdom, for his glory. And what you said made me laugh. It made me think, though, about the people who oftentimes it's like if they do something good and you say, man, that was so great. You leading up their worship, that was such a great song. You do such a great job. And they're afraid almost to take the compliment. And I think there's something to be said about that. It's that tension of, like, I appreciate that. I think it's okay to accept a compliment and say thank you, but it's that tension, right? Of I acknowledge that, man, I can't do any of these things apart from the grace of God. And I never want to start to begin to think that this is my show and that these things are mine alone, but rather the things that God has given to me.
Right. Or there's that passage in scripture where they call Herod, they're like, the voice of a God. And he's like, it is. And then God strikes him dead. Yeah. Like for all of us, we're like, we don't want to be that guy.
Please don't praise
me. I've
me.
often talked about that too. I've said the same thing to people is I don't think it honors God to not accept if someone compliments you, because I said, the way I've always worded it is like, if I gave you a gift, like an actual physical gift, and you opened it, looked at it and said, it's not really that good.
It's not that great.
Yeah, it'd be so insulting. And yet God gives us these gifts and we use them for his glory. And then someone compliments us, we should go, thank you.
Yeah.
They're like, oh man, you are such a good worship leader. Thank you. I know. And it's hard for me to take compliments at times, but on Sunday when someone's like, I really enjoy your preaching, I've had to learn to go, thank you. Yeah. Because I know in my heart and mind, here's what I know. I'm saying thank you, but I'm also acknowledging that is a gift from God. I know that. Like I know that in my heart. And I've stewarded it as best I'm able, and I know that process. But yeah, it is always that tension for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about today, and I thought it was such an incredible point, and I think it's something that probably all of us need to hear over and over again as a reminder. But when we think about the cross-centered life, it tells us that obedience, not effectiveness, or what we might call success is really the
Right.
true measurement of a faithful life, right?
Yeah.
And so we think about what it means to be Christ followers, what it means to exist in the world. So often we look at the things that we do and we ask ourselves, like, what is the fruit of this? How effective am I as a person, or when I did this thing or that thing? And you pointed out in such an intentional way, and I think, again, it's so important for us to hear that, no, it's actually the question of whether or not you were obedient to God. That's the really only measurement of success. And so, again, I just want to talk about, so people understand it, how does society even shape that? Because I think, again, this is a big one where when it comes to the idea of a successful person, we have certain things in mind, and usually they are metrics of, well, they've achieved this thing, they've achieved that thing. How has that shaped us? And really then, how does this truth liberate us, right? The truth that you shared, how does this liberate us so that we're no longer defined by what people think of us, and we're certainly then not defined by comparison?
I think if you think about the people that are most valued by our society, it's those who have found some level of success. And I watch it I watch it in my teenagers. I watch it and I remember what it was like when I was young. You think, like, to grow up and to have any level of influence at all, you have to become a famous sports person or famous actor or something that puts you in the limelight so everybody can see you. You know what I mean? And this was, I kind of illustrated it with the point on Sunday of, like, even in youth groups, it was become great so you can make God's name great. You know what I mean? And so, like, this idea of like, your greatness will glorify God and make him even more great. But what it was this pursuit of, like, and I don't even know how to say it, like, it fed into this idea of, like, my status is what's important. And so it gets masked. The glory to God masked that. What I've found in my life is that, though, all right, let me back up a second. I'm tripping over my words here. But what I've found is that the everyday faithfulness, the small things that I do that are obedient to God, those things have importance. It doesn't look like it has importance in our culture. Nobody may even know my name outside of the people in this room. You know what I'm saying? But if I'm obedient to God, that thing has efficacy in the kingdom of God. And so, like, that's the tension I think we have in our culture, is that it has to be big, it has to be nationally known to have any impact in the world. And God comes along and says, no, if you will do the things I ask you to do every single day, that is how the world changes. Yeah, because it's dependent on him, not on us.
What's so interesting about that is you're pointing out something. It really is, whose affirmation are you living for, right?
Yeah.
Like, this idea of, I have to do something big, I have to do something grand so that people see it, so that people acknowledge it, so that people affirm me and praise me and remind me of my value and my worth, right?
Yeah.
And so it really comes down to, who am I living for, right? Who am I looking to please? And then being able to gauge, what does that actually look like to please God? Is it actually being successful in the ways that society says to be successful, or is it something different?
Yeah.
Yeah, about 15 years ago, I read this report. So going back many, many years, like 100 years, they would ask these questions of the younger kids, and they would say, what do you want to be when you get older? And there was the common response. So for most of the history, it was things like doctor, and then it could be other positions, police officer, fireman, lawyer, different things like that. Then it started to change as technology changed, and you would get occasional astronaut in there. But I remember 15 years ago, it was like, for the first time ever, one of the response when they asked kids was, what do you want to be? And it was famous. And it wasn't even a defined thing. It wasn't a position. It was just famous. So, like, earlier you were just saying, like, you have to be a famous athlete or a famous actor. And I almost just stopped you and just said, just famous.
Yeah.
It's just one. And because that's what's happened is there has been that element, like, you have to, in order to be successful, it has to be recognized by the masses. And so there's different levels of fame. There's fame in high schools. That's popularity.
Yeah.
There's fame in community. Then there's national, international fame. But it does pivot when you're a Christian, and you now start to operate for the audience of one, and it's God. And if that never becomes real to you, you will constantly strive for something else, whether it's your own pride or it's the acknowledgement of other people. I really do think that's a critical piece, is that when you start to understand true success is defined solely by God, he's the only one that can define what it is, then that changes things. So, like, if I were to say to you right now, as Christians, okay, so we're measuring this as Christians, which one of these individuals is more successful? A person, and I'm not saying one is better than that. A person who works at McDonald's, fast food place, or a person who's a lawyer. Well, the answer is I haven't given you enough information.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
But our culture would say lawyer, doctor, whatever the one who makes more money is, right? But if I were to go back and say the person who works at McDonald's serves God and is a witness everywhere they go, this other person is a lawyer, not they might call themselves a Christian, but they're not a witness. They're not living by godly values. Which one's more successful? You would say it's clearly the person who's following God, because the other things are peripheral. They're temporary. And that's what's so often lost sight of in our culture is we embrace the temporary as if it's the most critical and most important thing, whereas what God would say, no, the eternal is. So when God is telling us to store up treasures in heaven, he's shifting our perspective to say the temporary riches are not the value that your culture tells you they are.
Right.
And so it is that shifting in your mind. Once you understand I'm operating for the audience of one, God, his standard is my standard, you do start to live differently. Now, all of a sudden, money doesn't have the same impact because you know full well money's going to go away. It comes, it goes, and one day it's all going to be destroyed. Fame is fleeting. I mean, it says in Scripture, you're like a vapor. You're there in the morning, you're gone in the morning. Yeah. Not even the next day. You know, it's like the dew. The sun rises and you're gone. So all those temporary things begin to change. I really do. I don't say this with any type of ego. I have seen that shift in my life as I've grown in spiritual maturity. Of the things that once mattered to me become less and less and less. And so now I have this value system that I don't care about fame. Like even my kids, I'm sure you guys, you deal with this. You'll get this here in a few years when your kids get a little bit older. But like your kids can't even imagine that you don't want to be famous. Like if my kids ask me that, like, Dad, wouldn't it be awesome to be famous? And I'm like, no, not even a little bit. And they think I'm being falsely humble.
Right.
Like I'm putting on, like, no, I don't want to be. I'm like, I can't even stress how much I don't want to be famous, but for many reasons, because I just want to do what God has called me to do. And that has shifted things for me. So like I even know my value system as a boss. I am a boss as the lead pastor over staff. I want to love you guys. I want to serve you guys because I realize this upside down kingdom of God is better. Yeah. It is better for me to serve the staff than it is to be served by the staff. And in my marriage, it is better to serve my wife than it is to be served by her because it just creates this healthy environment. It's better to have that posture with my kids. I could antagonize my kid. I do antagonize my kids. I could, the scripture says, don't provoke them to wrath. That's what I don't want to do, right? But just even serving kids, serving the community, it all because I'm trying to make God happy. Why? Because he has been so generous to me. Yeah. God has been so generous to me that I think it is the only proper response is to make him happy, to honor him, and to serve him. And if we never shift that in our minds, then culture will train us to think differently, and it is an illusion that always disappoints. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say, too, like, I think if we don't make that shift, the potential is we will always justify the means to get to the ends. And what that typically leads to is we're going to compromise. We're going to compromise our standards. We're going to compromise what we think is the most, whatever will get us to the place where we think we need to be successful or to be influential or famous. You know what I mean? And so the thing with Jesus is, and why obedience is so important, is the motivation was just as important to Jesus as what the people were doing. Yeah. And so the means were the end. You know what I'm saying? And so like it is a matter of like when we practice obedience, we are living out of a place where God accomplishes things, but God accomplishes things in his ways. Yeah. And so how does the world get changed? The world gets changed through sacrifice, submission, and love. How does that work? Only in the power of God. You know what I mean? Because it's the way he works.
Yeah. Right. And again, I'm not saying this for any type of ego. I promise you I'm not. But when you look at even us three in our lives, we've all had these pivotal seasons where we gave up something in order to pursue the kingdom of God in ministry. So for you gave up a job to become an intern. You went from top to bottom, right? Like you had a paying job. You left a success as a lead pastor just because God was calling you to go to a different area. I mean, I left Detroit to come here to be an assistant. Why did that make sense? It made sense to all of us. Why? Because we knew God was calling us and leading us. That calling and does not make sense if you're using the world standards. Because you're like, this is financially less, it's in authority less, in position less. You know, like I'd imagine all of us at some point told someone what we were going to do, and they thought, "You idiot." Is that fair?
Why would you do that?
I remember even talking to friends in the ministry, and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm going to leave a youth pastor job to go to this place. The only position they have open is an assistant. I don't care about titles." And they were like, I had friends literally say to me that were in the ministry, "You shouldn't do that," and because it didn't make sense in that moment to them, but to me, I was like, the only question is, what is God calling us to do?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you don't have that perspective in your life that God is leading you and God is safe in the sense that his will is good, if you don't have that, then you're going to fall back on the standards of the world consistently over and over, only to find that just lets you down.
Yeah, and in this whole conversation, just listening to you guys talk, I was just thinking two verses, or two places where Jesus speaks to this exact thing, right? Like the idea that the last will be first and the first will be last. I mean, that's a big one. Like the idea of the upside down kingdom. Would you rather be first on earth and last in the kingdom, or last on earth and first in the kingdom?
100%.
And then Jesus says something else to this, right? This idea of what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul, lose his soul. Right. And you think about the idea of pursuing money, pursuing fame, pursuing all of these things. What does it matter if you attain the world's measure of success if you are a failure in the kingdom, right? If you fail and you forfeit the life and calling that God has for you. And for us as Christians, that should be sobering. It should be encouraging and sobering. I think it's both. Yeah. And that is, right, God's rhythm, as you always say, like this idea of encouragement and challenge. The good news is our identity is not based on what people think or the world's measurement of success. And so there's an encouragement. And every single day, regardless if you work at McDonald's, regardless if you feel insignificant, the question is, are you being faithful to God? Are you being obedient? Absolutely. If the answer is yes, then by God's metrics, you are living a successful life. And this life is it's a vapor, as you said, and we're going to live for eternity, reaping what we've sown here on earth. Yeah. And that's something to be encouraged by. So
yeah, I love that image that you just said. I mean, I really do. Like it encourages my spirit to know that there are people that this world could tell them that you're a failure. And literally Jesus is looking at them and admiring them in the sense of like, look at them. Yeah. They are following me. They are a success, storing up treasures for them in heaven. Yeah. That like they're doing things here on earth and everyone else is like, oh, they're not very successful and they're having mansions in heaven in that sense, if you want to use that context. And so like, even like you said, the words of Jesus, what will it profit a man? I mean, this idea of you can literally attain every standard that you've set for your life here on earth and it means nothing. And in other places, Jesus goes, that group's going to be tossed out where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the idea of gnashing of teeth is they're going to be angry and frustrated because they were like, but I pursued all of this and I attained all of this, and realized, what did they actually miss? Yeah. They missed eternal life. Right. They missed this real, genuine gift of life, and what they embraced was something temporary that has let them down. And again, that is sobering.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys. Want to give you a chance. Do you have any parting words for those who might be listening to this conversation?
I was thinking about this when I was preparing for the message. I didn't get a chance to say it in the message, but I showed my cross, the thing that I wear around my neck, and Matthew, you even talked about it earlier about how we wear a cross as a good luck charm. I was thinking about this as I was preparing. This cross has never, I would say, it has never saved anyone. So I wear this cross around my neck. I've worn it for 25 years. I don't know that anybody's come to the Lord because of this cross. This cross has had influence on one person and one person alone, me. And it's because it represents to me what the cross-shaped life looks like. Do you know how many people are going to be in the kingdom of God because of your cross-shaped life? Right. You know what I mean? Yeah. That is the thing. So it's not a piece of jewelry. It's not just a symbol. It's when we embrace the way of Jesus, that is how God is going to transform the world. And so as we learn to become more like him, as we learn to take on these postures of humility and service and submission, and we look to work in the world this way, God is going to transform our communities, our families, through those actions, not any jewelry, T-shirts, or bumper stickers we have.
Yeah, it's good.
I'd like to encourage, just to continue with what we were just saying, I'd like to encourage anyone that is feeling just down because they don't have what we would say is earthly success. Yeah. They don't have, whether it be riches or fame or power, and they feel like a failure, I want to encourage them genuinely that following God, you are honoring God, and that is true success.
Yes.
And that is eternal success, and you're going to receive an eternal reward. I think it's okay to celebrate that. Jesus consistently in his teaching always put it in the context of eternity and reward. That's not something we should shy away from. We talked about earlier, we were like, oh no, false humility. Like, oh no. And I think the same thing, like, oh no, I'm not doing this for the reward. Yeah, we are. Like, this is what Jesus promised. He wanted us to have this perspective of like, there's going to be reward. And there are a lot of people that are missing according to the standards of our world, but they're crushing it in the kingdom. Yeah. I hope that just encourages people to not lose sight of that. They're sacrificing now, but they're going to really be blessed for eternity.
Yeah. So you know who really focused on that? C.S. Lewis.
I love C.S.
There
Lewis.
it is.
I love quoting him.
You had to find a way to sneak it in there right before the end.
We haven't talked about him yet today. So
I was going to say the line earlier, and I was going to botch it, but then I was like, I'm not even sure it's his. Well, you say it often. It's when people they emphasize, they make the good.
Like the ultimate?
The ultimate. Is that C.S. Lewis or is that Tim Keller?
I have no idea.
Okay.
It's one of those things, we talk about that before. After you read so many things at some point in time, you're like, I don't know where this came from, but it's shaped me in some profound way.
You quote the author the first 2 times, and then it starts to become yours, and then it turns into I've always said.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion, guys. I appreciate your wisdom and insight. And as always, we really do thank you for taking the time to watch, to listen. And we hope it encourages you. We hope it blesses you, not just to learn more information, but to take you deeper in your walk with Jesus. And so, as always, if it does, we would love for you to share it with other people, because we want as many people to be blessed and encouraged by this as possible. But again, we thank you. We love you. We hope you have a great week. God bless.